attention to the man behind the curtain.
I just got this Bible yesterday. Of course, I have all these other student version this and version that, and then I saw in the syllabus our professor here uses the Revised Standard Version, and I said, well,
there you are.
So the thrift shop always have all these Bibles lined up.
That's a great place.
For 16 cents, you get a whole brand new Bible that's not scratching.
Well, I don't get hung up over much on different translations. I do have a great love for the when you're dealing with the Bible, something that's a little more word for word rather than thought for thought is definitely my preference, and the NRS tends to be just a tickle more in the literal direction than the New American Bible or some of the others. But if I could make everybody at gunpoint adopt the RSV, it would probably be where I'd have everybody land. But this is where we're at. Okay. The one thing that I have discovered, and it's something that as I've been doing the Catholic ecclesiology thing, is whenever you get an ecclesiological text, people really love talking about the biblical foundations for ecclesiology, but especially modern treatments of ecclesiology always start with the New Testament, and I think that there are a couple of different reasons why the Old Testament gets excluded, and they're perfectly understandable, but there are some pretty serious limits to this approach, I think, because it tends to obscure a little bit what in the world Jesus was doing in the Gospels and what St. Paul thought was going on, and so negating the essential continuity between Israel's story and the church's story is a glaring weakness and a persistent kind of problem. The two demons that everybody's worried about, is one. Is this broad specter of supersessionism. Supersessionism is this notion that is there as a mindset from the earliest Christianity, from Justinian's Codex on up through the homilies of St. John Chrysostom, this idea that the church is a replacement of Israel. And you can see how this would become a persistent kind of problem. In the earliest liturgies of the church really reflect the situation of the earliest Christians. In the 2nd century and into the 3rd century, there was a subtle transformation. You can actually see it in the iconography that survives in the catacombs at Rome. The earliest stage of the catacombs, you get a lot of iconography that emphasizes the continuity of early Christians with Israel. And that's led scholars to sort of think that one of the things that was going on there was because the Jews enjoyed an exemption officially from the imperial cult, from the obligation to offer the pinch of incense and eat of the meals that were sacrificed to the emperor, that Christians, predominantly Jewish, but even the Gentile Christians that were converting, were trying to kind of cozy up to that Jewish connection to sort of maintain the appearance that that they were Jews, and therefore similarly not obliged to participate in the imperial sacrifice. They would either do that, or they would adopt imagery that emphasized their continuity with Greco-Roman bits and pieces here and there. As the parting of the ways between the church and the synagogue began to kind of establish itself, you see a marked shift in the images in San Sebastiano, especially, where the Old Testament imagery begins to slake into what we think of as Christian imagery specifically. So, Madonna and Child, Eucharistic appearances of a meal, and crucifixes, images of Jesus specifically. Well, as the church gained a kind of ascendancy, especially after Constantine's conversion and all of that in the 4th century, this supersessionism became kind of a big danger. It's there in Chrysostom's homilies against the Jews. Oftentimes, if you weren't aware of when they were written, you would mistake them for things that were written in Germany in the 1930s. They're just really awful. And the idea was there, this idea that because the Jews had engaged in deicide, that they had, surrendered their covenantal connection to Yahweh, and therefore now the church was supplanting Israel. Well, obviously the 1930s made that deeply problematic. The Holocaust was enough of a crisis that it awakened Christians to the pernicious problem with supersessionism. And because of that, after the Holocaust, a couple of decades, you have Vatican II, and that supersessionist instinct that survived right up until the pontificate of Pius XII, who wasn't Hitler's pope, by the way, but who did have this supersessionism as part of his understanding of the relationship between Israel and the church. Vatican II steps in and starts to rearrange that supersessionist idea, not surrendering a notion that Christ is the covenant Lord of one people of God, but beginning to shift the way we might perceive the relationship of Israel to the church. And so you have the advent of a way of talking about Israel as our older brothers in the faith, things like this, recognizing that there's this connection, and particularly that the covenanted promises of Yahweh to Israel are not invalidated, that whatever we look to, whatever we hope for, as far as the grand purposes of God reconciling the world to himself, that it includes both Jew and Gentile. So here's a good one. Nostra Aetate makes use of this language. God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes or of the calls he issues. Although the church is the new people of God, the Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God, as if this followed from the Holy Scriptures. And similarly, get language from John Paul II. He made a famous visit to a synagogue in Mainz in 1980 and called the Jews the people of God of the Old Covenant, which has never been abrogated by God. The gifts and callings of God are irrevocable, quoting Romans chapter 11. Again, in 1997, John Paul II affirmed this. This people continues in spite of everything to be the people of the covenant, and despite human infidelity, the Lord is faithful to his covenant. So on down to the present, in the writings of people like Walter Kasper, and obviously who's been terribly formative even for Pope Francis. This notion that Israel has not invalidated its covenantal identity or the promises of God, and that while the church remains the new people of God, the Israel of God, as St. Paul would talk about in the book of Galatians, recognizing that there is yet some purposes, for the people of Israel according to the flesh, and that covenant has not been abrogated or superseded in a strict sense by the church. The other big problem is at the end. If this one emphasizes, this radical break between Israel and the church, the other one that we experience more in an American culture from the 19th century is this spire that is dispensationalism. And what ends up happening in dispensationalism was innovated by a preacher in the Plymouth Brethren, John Nelson Darby, in England in the 19th century. And Darbyite religion became popularized through something that you may have even heard of, the Schofield Reference Bible. Protestants know that name well. The Schofield Reference Bible is basically has the text of the Revised King James without the Apocrypha, and then Schofield's notes. And because generations of Protestant Christians have read the Bible through the lens of Schofield, and Schofield obviously was refracting Darby's theology, this dispensationalist stuff is all the rage in many Protestant circles. Reformed Protestants, Presbyterians being one major exception. But if you've seen talk about the rapture or
Left Behind series.
the Left Behind series, I at one time when I finished Bible college in 1994, the Pentecostal church that I was a part of, the Assemblies of God, had a real scholarly engagement with the Evangelical Theological Society, and contributing to a group within the ETS called the Dispensational Study Group. And at the time, it was including guys from these dispensational powerhouse seminaries, like Dallas Theological Seminary, and Trinity was TEDS was very much a part of these kinds of conversations. And people were beginning to see the real problem. What dispensationalism does is, if supersessionism kind of leads to this sharp distinction, where the church replaces Israel, full stop, dispensationalism sort of segregates the two, so that Israel's covenants remain pure and inviolable, and that what God has done is simply established a new covenant with the Gentiles. So what you have is not one people of God being replaced full stop by a new people of God. What you have in dispensationalism classically is two peoples of God, two covenants, and never the twain shall meet. Now, that dispensational study group in the 1980s and early 90s was starting to make a real critique that this really does violence to the way the New Testament reads itself, to the way the Old Testament reads itself. And so lots of evangelical scholars were kind of coming around this idea that maybe the dispensationalist thinking and the rapture theology and all of the stuff that kind of comes with that is a bad way to go, that there are real problems in it. Well, then to